Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
It happened when I was about 15, during a trip to Los Angeles. I'd grown up watching movies, dreaming about one day seeing the magic of Hollywood with my own eyes. The thought of stepping onto those streets with all the glitz and glamour made my heart race. When we finally made it there, I was on cloud 9. We took the classic tourist route, stopping by Rodeo Drive, cruising down Sunset Boulevard, and hopping on one of those red tour buses that run all day. Earlier, we'd even visited the Kodak Theater, home to the Oscars. I imagined all the great actors and actresses who'd stood in that very spot. It was everything I'd dreamed of. But as the day wore on, reality started to kick in. Hollywood wasn't as glamorous as I had imagined. The red carpets didn't stretch across every street, and the flashing lights weren't on every corner. Instead, the city felt gritty, rough around the edges. It wasn't the dazzling place I thought it would be, but there was something strangely fascinating about it. The eccentric, sometimes even sad characters I saw on the streets felt like something out of a movie. But they were real. It felt like I had stumbled into the true essence of Hollywood. The side that wasn't shown on screen, yet somehow felt just as alive. One of our next stops was Warner Brothers Studios. We didn't rent a car, so we took the bus from Hollywood Boulevard to get there. While waiting at the bus stop, we were bombarded by street vendors, all offering their wares or experiences. We'd gotten used to it by then, mostly ignoring them, but one man just wouldn't leave us alone. He was older, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, dressed in an oversized Hawaiian shirt and a floppy straw hat. His hair was a mess of gray strands hanging past his shoulders. I didn't like him the moment I saw him, not because of his appearance, but because something just felt off about him. Still, I didn't think too much about it at first. Before we could even politely turn him down, he was already launching into a spiel, telling us all about his tour. It wasn't like the regular ones we'd already done. He promised to show us hidden Hollywood gems, places no other tour would take us. He mentioned taking us right in front of the Hollywood sign, as close as we could touch it. He also threw in a claim that he could show us Marilyn Monroe's grave, conveniently located right in front of the sign. A small part of me hesitated. Those things didn't seem quite right, but his enthusiasm and insistence wore me down. Maybe he was just a regular guy doing his job, I thought. Maybe I was overreacting. So we agreed. We'd follow him to his bus, which he claimed would take us on the best tour yet. What happened next still haunts me. We followed him down the street, and as we walked, he started chatting with strangers along the way, people he claimed to know. The first was a young girl at a ticket booth. He waved to her and said, "You know me, right? I'm just showing these lovely ladies around. You know I'm a good guy, right?" She looked totally confused, and all she could manage was a nervous, yeah. My mum and I exchanged an uncomfortable look, but for some reason we kept walking. Next he waved to a cop across the street, who half raised a hand in acknowledgement. "See? Even the police know me," he said, grinning. By now I was starting to feel that uncomfortable knot in my stomach. Why was he going out of his way to prove he knew people? We arrived at the place where we were supposed to meet the rest of the tour group, but it wasn't what I expected. Instead of a clean, professional-looking tour bus, we were standing in front of an old, beat-up white sedan. It was obvious the car had seen better days. My heart sank. Something wasn't right, but we were too polite to back out. At least that's what I thought at the time. The man didn't give us much choice. He stared at us, silently waiting for us to get in. After a long, awkward pause, my mum and I glanced at each other. We both thought the same thing. This was bad. But before we could voice our concerns, he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Mom," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The car was already moving. My mom, bless her heart, tried to think of an excuse, but he wouldn't let her leave. I was now fully aware that this wasn't some quirky tour guide. This man wasn't right in the head. I had seen enough horror movies to know this was the part where the audience screams at the screen. "What are you doing? Get out of there, Mom! Get out of the car!" I yelled, my heart racing. Fortunately, she reacted quickly and got out just before he could drive off. We ran back toward the bus stop, our hearts pounding in our chests. Just as we turned the corner, I heard his voice booming behind us. "What's the problem, huh? You scared of me? You scared I'm not trustworthy?" he shouted, his voice growing louder with each step. "I'll give you a better deal. Just wait, I'll show you." By some miracle, our tour bus pulled up right then. Without a second thought, we jumped on, not looking back. I was still trying to process everything, trying to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe he just needed the sale. But even as I said it, I knew deep down that was a lie. We had dodged something that could have been far worse. As we sat on the bus, my mom tried to rationalize everything. "He's just trying to make a living, honey. I'm sure he wasn't dangerous." "Maybe," I said, but even as I said it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. But he never sold us anything. And there's no way he could have taken us right up to the Hollywood sign. Plus, I'm pretty sure Marilyn Monroe isn't buried anywhere near it. I tried to laugh it off, but I was still terrified. There was no telling what might have happened if we had stayed. The fear in my gut hadn't been wrong, and I knew it. The man was off, and deep down I knew he wasn't just a weird guy. He was something far more dangerous. So, to the creepy man in the Hawaiian shirt and straw hat, let's just say this. Let's not meet again. You scared me then, and you still haunt me now. I grew up in a tiny, rundown house perched on a hill that overlooked the quiet outskirts of a city that seemed to never sleep. It wasn't the glamorous kind of neighborhood you hear about when people talk about the city. Back then, it was a place filled with faded buildings, old trees, and narrow, crumbling streets that seemed to go on forever. The city, which should have been full of life and excitement, felt quiet and desolate most of the time. My parents weren't the overprotective type, maybe because they'd grown up in a small town in the Midwest. They didn't have to worry much about dangers. Everything there was simpler, safer. I guess that's why they thought it was fine for me to roam the streets alone, the way I did for most of my childhood. I was an only child, and the few other kids who lived nearby were either too much older or younger than me. It wasn't really a place for families, and the streets were barely paved. I spent most of my time alone, creating my own little worlds, pretending I was somewhere else, somewhere magical. The hills became my kingdom, the cracked sidewalks my boundaries. I didn't mind being alone. I didn't need anyone else to entertain me, but I did notice how different things were around me. The area had always felt a little off, a little worn out, as if it was a place that had seen better days. There were always people around, but they were either too old to care or too wrapped up in their own lives to notice a young kid wandering alone. Most of the people in the neighborhood were aging hippies or struggling artists, just trying to get by. One afternoon, when I was about 8 or 9, my mom picked me up from school and we headed back home, just like any other day. The house was quiet. The cats were lounging on the windowsills, and the usual hum of the neighborhood outside was strangely calming. We dropped our school bags by the door, kicked off our shoes, and went through the motions of the usual routine. I greeted the cats. My mom started going through the mail, and we both went to the answering machine to listen to any new messages. That's when everything changed. The message that played through the machine was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A deep, raspy voice crackled through the speaker, sending an immediate chill down my spine. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt like it had been left just for me. The man's voice was gleeful, but there was something about it that made my stomach twist. "I would love to scare your daughter," he said. And then he laughed. The laugh wasn't a joyful sound, it was too exaggerated, too long, too real. It wasn't the kind of laugh you'd hear in a movie like some villain plotting. It was raw, it felt real. It was the kind of laugh that made my skin crawl. I don't even remember hearing the rest of it. My mom quickly pressed stop, cutting off the man's voice, but it felt like the room had been left frozen. I could still hear it echoing in my head, the way it had filled the house with a tension I couldn't shake. My world felt different, like the walls that once kept me safe had suddenly grown thinner. I expected my mum to be freaked out, but she wasn't. Instead, she shrugged it off, acting like it was just some silly prank. "Don't worry about it, honey," she said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the crack in her voice. I remember thinking, why isn't she scared? Shouldn't she be? And more than that, why wasn't she doing anything? Why didn't she want to report it? It wasn't just a prank, it felt wrong. But my mom acted like it was nothing, like she didn't think it was important, which just made it even more unsettling. As I got older, I tried to bring it up with her, but she always dismissed it, as though it was a distant memory. "Oh yeah, I remember that," she would say, with an almost awkward smile. "It was just someone messing around. Nothing to worry about." But that was never enough for me. Even now, as an adult, it still makes me uneasy to think about. After that day, I could never walk around the neighborhood alone without feeling like I was being watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always out there, hiding somewhere in the shadows, waiting to find me. Every time I wandered too far from the house, I would hear something in the distance, footsteps or whispers carried by the wind. It wasn't until years later that I realized how deeply that moment had affected me. It wasn't just a random prank. It was something darker, something that lingered in the background of my thoughts, never letting me fully relax. As a kid, I would tell myself that I was being silly, that it was nothing, that there was no way the man's voice could have meant anything. But deep down, I knew I was wrong. Maybe it was my instinct, or maybe it was the way he'd laughed, but something about him felt real. He wasn't just some harmless person pulling a joke. I started to wonder if he had been watching me, if he had known exactly where I was. That thought kept me up some nights, and still, to this day, I can't help but feel a little uneasy whenever I walk through the same streets, now long since developed and transformed. My mom's words still echo in my head when I think back on that day. She had tried to convince me that there was nothing to fear, that it was just some weird prank, but I never believed it. It's strange how, as a kid, you trust your parents to protect you from everything, and when they don't seem concerned, it throws you off. I suppose that's why I can't seem to forget that moment, because it wasn't just a prank. It was a glimpse into a darker side of the world, a side that never really left me. I've always wondered what would have happened if we had gone with that man, if we'd just ignored that gut feeling and gotten into his car, but I'll never know. All I know is that I never walked alone after that day. I don't think I could have even if I wanted to. There's a certain fear that sticks with you, something unexplainable that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. And that's exactly what happened with me. He left a mark on me, one that I'll never be able to fully shake. That voice, that laugh, I'll never forget it. So, whoever you were, whatever your intentions were, let's just hope we never meet again. Because some things, some people, are just better left in the past. I was barely 18 when I almost walked right into a nightmare. I had just run away to California with a guy who was way too old for me, 34 to be exact. His name was James, and in retrospect, he was a controlling jerk. But back then, I thought his possessiveness was just him caring too much. We were homeless, living in my beat-up car somewhere on the edge of Los Angeles, while I held on to this ridiculous dream of being a model. One of those girls from the alternative scene with tattoos and piercings who posed for edgy photos. I didn't even know what I was getting myself into, but I just wanted something bigger than what I had back in the small town I'd run away from. Things in LA got a lot crazier than I could have imagined. But one incident stands out, something that still haunts me today. It was an ordinary day at a coffee shop on Hollywood Boulevard. I remember the place being a little busy, buzzing with the usual crowd, but something felt off when this man walked in. He was well dressed, too put together for a coffee shop, and his gaze kept finding its way to me. I was used to attention. Being young and full of dreams, I loved when people looked my way. But there was something different about his stare. It wasn't just a glance. It was intense, almost like he was calculating me. Eventually, He walked over to our table, his footsteps sharp and deliberate. He had a thick German accent and, without much preamble, offered me a cigarette. I accepted, half out of politeness, half because I didn't have money for anything else, and I figured it couldn't hurt. He introduced himself as Face, which struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. He said he was a photographer, and his voice had that strange mix of confidence and something else, something almost predatory. He kept going on about his work and the camera he was holding, but it was the way he mentioned it that felt forced, like he was overcompensating. He asked if he could take some pictures of me, and at first I didn't think much of it. He showed me photos on his camera, naked women posing provocatively, and that's when my gut started telling me that something was wrong. But then, he said something that made my stomach twist. "You're not shy, are you? I like my models confident, professional. My girls, they're never shy." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. He completely ignored James, who was sitting there looking uncomfortable. It was almost like I wasn't even supposed to have a boyfriend in the first place, and that's when he dropped the bomb. "You need to lose him if you want to make it. I can't have him ruining this for you. If you want to get somewhere, you need to do this on your own." His words made my heart race. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing. He was famous, right? That's what he kept saying. He worked at some prestigious art school and had these pictures of women, real models. I was desperate, right? Desperate for validation, for anything that would get me out of the streets. The idea of being noticed, finally being seen, was more tempting than anything else. When James went to the bathroom, Face leaned in closer and dropped another bombshell. "You need to be alone for this, no boyfriends, just you and me." Something about his tone made me feel like I was in over my head, but the lure of a potential break, of real fame, clouded my judgment. I asked for a business card, but Face hesitated, stalling before saying, "I'll call you, don't worry about that." I gave him my number, not really thinking it through. What did I have to lose, right? Weeks passed, and I thought it was just some weird interaction, one I'd forget about. Then, one day, I was in Arcadia, California, and my phone rang. It was Face. He was furious that I hadn't dumped James yet. He was insistent. He could fly me back to LA and we could do the shoot without any distractions. It was tempting, almost overwhelming. But when I told James, he wasn't worried about me. He was mad that I'd even think of leaving him behind. He didn't want to lose control over me, over everything. I never went. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later, when I was scrolling online, looking for anything that could verify Face's story, that I started piecing things together. There was no art school under the name he'd given me. No photographer with a reputation like he claimed. I found nothing, absolutely nothing. The panic hit me like a brick. If I'd gone to that photo shoot alone, would I have disappeared? Would I have become just another face in a city full of ghosts? I can't stop wondering, and I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't the only one out there like that. A few years ago, I was working as an office assistant at a small catering company in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't glamorous, but the job paid the bills, and it wasn't too bad considering the area we were in. We were tucked away in a building just off a busy street. A nice neighborhood where everything seemed calm and upscale. The company didn't just cater. They hosted all kinds of events. Wine tastings, cooking classes, private parties. It was one of those places that seemed safe and harmless, where people came to unwind and indulge. I spent most of my days running errands between the office and the kitchen, handling phone calls, managing schedules, and making sure the events went smoothly. I didn't think twice about being there alone. It was a fancy neighborhood after all. I'd leave the front gate open during the day, thinking nothing of it. It wasn't until one afternoon when everything changed. I was walking back from the kitchen to the office, carrying some paperwork, when I passed by the dining room and noticed someone sitting at the head table. At first I thought maybe there had been some sort of booking I had missed. I was always running around, so it wasn't unusual for me to forget details. But when I walked closer, I felt something shift in the air. The man at the table didn't belong there. His appearance was jarring. He was dressed in layers, long sleeves, long pants. Despite it being one of the hottest days of the year, his clothes looked worn and dirty. His hair was long and unkempt, wild in a way that made me uneasy. I had no idea how he had even gotten in. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I stood frozen by the door, staring at him, my mind racing. "Sorry, I didn't see you come in. Can I help you with something?" I said, my voice steady, though I could feel my blood run cold. Something didn't feel right. As I spoke, I realized he was holding something on the table in front of him, a butcher's knife. He wasn't holding it in a way that seemed accidental or careless. No, he was carefully playing with it, almost fondling it. My stomach dropped. He didn't seem at all fazed by my presence. Slowly, he looked up at me and said, "I'm just waiting for a menu." For a split second, I couldn't speak. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away from this man who had no business being there, who had a knife in his hands and the look of someone who didn't care about the consequences. But I couldn't show fear. I forced a smile, nodding, trying to keep my voice from shaking as I said, "Sure, let me get that for you." As soon as I stepped out of his line of sight, my body went into autopilot. I didn't even hesitate. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I rushed across the street to the nearest restaurant, hoping my legs would carry me fast enough. I couldn't believe what was happening. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I had to get help. The thought of returning to that place alone with him still inside, it terrified me. The police arrived quickly, almost too quickly, and I watched from across the street as they escorted the man out of the building. He didn't resist, but his expression was unreadable. It was like he was in his own world, detached from the reality that I had just experienced. The officers told me he was homeless and probably mentally ill, which made sense in a way. It explained the bizarre behavior, the sense of calm he had despite holding a deadly weapon. But it didn't make me feel any less shaken. The company didn't press charges. They said it wasn't worth the trouble, that he was just another lost soul. I didn't argue. He had been harmless in a way. But that didn't stop the knot in my stomach every time I thought about it. I could still picture him there, sitting at the table, casually playing with that knife, like he was waiting for dinner to be served. After that day, I never left the gates open again, especially not when I was alone. It only took one moment of recklessness to realize how easily things could go from normal to terrifying. The man with the knife? I never wanted to meet him again. And yet, I can't help but think about how close I came to something much worse. How I might never have walked out of that building again. Back in 2011, I made a spontaneous decision to leave behind the hustle and bustle of New York and start fresh in Los Angeles. I didn't know a soul out here, but I was young and optimistic, convinced I could make new friends and figure things out as I went. My best friend had interned at a big animation studio the previous summer, and before leaving, she gave me the contact info for a guy she'd met named Tom. He seemed like a great guy, so I decided to reach out, hoping I could get to know him and maybe find my place in the city. Tom and I hit it off right away. He lived in a cozy house in West Hollywood, sharing it with 3 other roommates, and they had a laid-back vibe that was perfect for me. The house had this small guest house in the back where the landlord lived. I'd passed by the guy a couple of times. He was hard to miss, really. Tall, muscular, with these striking blue eyes. He had that look, you know, the kind that made everyone stop and stare, like he was born to be in front of a camera. But despite all that, something about him never sat right with me. We didn't speak much at first, just small pleasantries when I'd walk in and out of the house. But then one day I got a Facebook friend request from him. That felt odd, especially since we barely exchanged a word. His name wasn't even that easy to find, so I wondered how he'd found me. But being new to LA and not wanting to seem standoffish, I accepted. Almost immediately he started messaging me, asking me to go out for drinks. And not just once. He was persistent. He even offered to pick me up and said I could crash at his place if I had too much to drink. I'll admit, I wasn't exactly the most self-assured 22-year-old, but something about him gave me the chills. He was this older, model-like guy, and I felt like a fish out of water compared to him. We had absolutely nothing in common, and it didn't take long for my gut to tell me this wasn't someone I should be spending time with. Tom was moving out in a month anyway, so I figured it'd be fine to just avoid him and move on. I blocked him on Facebook, and that was the end of it, or so I thought. A couple of weeks later, Tom and I were both pretty drunk, chatting late one night. He mentioned he hadn't seen the landlord in a while, which struck me as odd. In our drunken haze, we both decided it would be a great idea to go check out the guest house and see what was up with him. We stumbled down the dark backyard path, our footsteps unsteady but full of curiosity. As we got closer to the guest house, we noticed the outdoor furniture, seats and tables, were covered with old, stained sheets. The dim light of our phones illuminated the fabric, revealing dark, deep red and brown stains scattered across the sheets. Some of the fabric was torn, like it had been slashed or ripped. I felt my stomach drop. I had a sudden, sharp feeling that something was wrong. Something really wrong. I didn't need to say anything. Tom, in his usual carelessness, made a joke, laughing like it was nothing. "Probably just some wild party stuff, you know," he said, shrugging it off. But I couldn't laugh. I couldn't even speak. My body was shaking, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The smell of the sheets was nauseating, metallic like copper. It was sickening. Without saying another word, I turned and called a cab. I told Tom I wasn't stepping foot back in that house until he found somewhere else to live. My stomach was in knots, and I didn't feel safe anymore. I had no idea what those stains were or why they were there, but I knew I never wanted to find out. I never heard from the landlord again. He seemed to vanish from my life as quickly as he'd entered it, and I thought that was the end of the story. But then over a year later, while I was out having lunch with my boyfriend at a local cafe, I saw him. My heart sank. There across the room was the landlord, looking at me with those cold blue eyes, the same unsettling gaze. Our eyes met, and his expression twisted into something strange, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't a smile or even a look of recognition. It was something far more unsettling, like he was looking through me. My stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain. I quickly turned my attention back to my boyfriend, pretending like I hadn't noticed anything. But that moment stayed with me for a long time. I never saw the landlord again after that, but I've always wondered what he was up to, what he was hiding. And the memory of those stained sheets still makes me shudder, even now.